Welcome to Complexity Medicine, Align and Design. Align and Design is an interactive group discourse, discussion, and dialogue whereby we seek to mutually explore and create a shared pattern language and an implied design thinking process as it relates to health design, leadership, implementation, and integration. Join us as we seek to understand and apply primary patterns and first principles of engagement in the development of systems of care, connection, as well as means towards physiological and ecological well-being at scale. I am artist Andy McClure, and this is Dr. William Sutherland, your hosts.
All right, so welcome everybody for week 4 of our Align and Design inquiry and process. And I want to start with those words, inquiry and process, because this is something that is in development. It is not a set curriculum. It is not a finished idea by any means. We don't really even know exactly where we're sailing to, although we are out sailing. We're navigating somewhere, and we've got some ideas of where the horizon may lie and where there may be a port of call. But at this point, we're largely moving on intuition and instinct in a direction, holding this idea of what is health. And the reminder is that is always the question. That is the primary question, the primary metaphor, and the primary when we're using that notion of koans, the question that we hold in the midst of our great doubt. What is health? And so one of the things as we go in, before we go in today, I just want to do a quick little recap or review back to last week. And if you remember last week, that we had the notion of about or within and the importance of choosing your preposition or the proper preposition. Are you an about person? Are you a within person? And as far as harvesting from last week, a sense of a learning, rather than all the individual stories, I was really just struck by the nature of how I asked a question and the nature of the response to two different kinds of questions. And it was inadvertent, but it really showed that difference between when we were in about and outside and bring and hold a question. I think you're hearing my fax in the background there, the tyranny of the doctor's office. The idea that that even our questions can be questions that are afraid in the notion of an about frame versus a within frame. And so, for example, when I asked everybody about what their answer was to, I believe it was, what is health, right? I sort of demanded an answer, what is health? But I think I asked it from that outside position. I wasn't asking what is health to all of you from my health. I was asking it as an abstraction, and I was asking it from an abstracted place. And it was fascinating to see the response, which was no response. I think we had 16 people on the call, and no one motioned or raised their hand to answer and participate in the question because it wasn't participatory. Right? It was asked from outside of health, and it shut everybody down. And boy, did that throw me into a moment of dis-ease, right? Again, sorry, I apologize for the facts that you're hearing come through. A moment of dis-ease. Then there was a chance to pivot and to go from the about or that outside position to the within. And then a question arose inside. Question that really I was asking in that moment, what's brought me here? What has brought me here to this moment? Of course, in the moments that are difficult, we ask those questions. And I asked you all, what has brought you here to this Align and Design community, this meeting? Why are you putting your time towards this? And then all of a sudden, I asked it from within, and everybody answered from within. And for those of us that were here, we could see what was dialogue that was brought forth, and the harvest that came forth in that sharing was that people were willing to be vulnerable, people were willing to be open, people were willing to share the rawness or the liveness or just the trueness of where they were at in that moment, And they were willing to share how they were affected by others, people in that same within position, right? So we got to feel other people. We got to feel the feelings others had, right? We got to experience the experiencing. And that was a really profound shift. And I think it was really nice that that incident, that moment, that change became a metalogue, became an example of that very koan that we were exploring in health last week. So that's the take that I wanted to bring from last week to this week, what I wanted to bridge over. Now, this week's koan is a little simpler one. It's just 2 words. It's self-referential and it's iterative. And the 2 words are invert inversions. Invert inversions. And this is the health koan as part of our design language or pattern language that we're going to explore today. And so I've got a couple of readings. And so more than just quotes today, I've actually got some readings that are just a little bit more lengthy. But I want to set the stage with these readings and these quite fantastic words of others. Just let me reach for my reading glasses just 1 second here. What podcasting has taught me as I see my own reflection back from the camera is that I have more gray hairs than I realized, and that I need to reach for my glasses more often than I care to remember. All right. So the first quote, now this was by the ex-president of what was then Czechoslovakia, just at the fall of the Soviet Union. This is a quote from Václav Havel, who was very much interested in a humanistic and an ecological model of governing. So he wrote, and this particular quote I'm taking from this book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, by Daniel Christian Wall. And this is an excellent book. I'm just working my way into it, but I'm very much enjoying it. And certainly when we're talking about health design, this is going to make its way to the reading list. So Václav Havel writes, a genuine, profound, and lasting change for the better can no longer result from the victory of any particular traditional political conception, which can ultimately be only external. That is, a structural or systemic conception. More than ever before, such a change will have to derive from human existence, from the fundamental reconstitution of the position of people in the world, their relationship to each other in the universe. If a better economic and political model is to be created, then perhaps it must derive from profound existential and moral changes in the society. This is not something that can be designed and introduced like a new car. If it is to be more than just a new variation on the old degeneration, it must above all be an expression of life in the process of transforming itself. A better system will not automatically ensure a better life. In fact, the opposite is true. Only by creating a better life can a better system be developed. Let me just repeat that last clause. Only by creating a better life can a better system be developed. So last week, you remember I introduced the work of Iain McGilchrist and his book, The Master and the Emissary. And I'm going to read from there today because, again, his notion of the importance of hemispheric differences between the right and the left as the fact that we contain 2 very distinct ways, 2 needed ways, but 2 very distinct ways of perceiving and co-creating a world. And they act in a way like binocular vision, that each of these minds, these views, creates the whole that allows us, ideally to succeed as humans in this world, providing the right balance is there. And so he has a wonderful metaphor to explain these differences, which are going to be essential to the koan Invert Inversions today. And he writes, there is a story in Nietzsche that goes something like this. There was once a wise spiritual master who was the ruler of a small but prosperous domain and was known for his selfless devotion to his people. As his people flourished and grew in number, the bounds of the small domain spread, and with it the need to trust implicitly the emissaries he sent to ensure the safety of its ever more distant parts. It was not just that it was impossible for him personally to order all that needed to be dealt with. As he wisely saw, he needed to keep his distance from and remain ignorant of such concerns. And so he nurtured and trained carefully his emissaries in order that they could be trusted. Eventually, however, his cleverest and most ambitious vizier, the one he most trusted to do his work, began to see himself as the master and used his position to advance his own wealth and influence. He saw his master's temperance and forbearance as weakness, not wisdom, and on his missions on the master's behalf, adopted his mantle as his own. The emissary became contemptuous of his master, and so it came about that the master was usurped, the people were duped, the domain became a tyranny, and eventually it collapsed in ruins. And so that's the metaphor of Iain McGilchrist's work in this book. And now here's some of the biology that goes with that. And he writes, experience is forever in motion, ramifying and unpredictable. In order for us to know anything at all, that thing must have enduring properties. If all things flow and one can never step into the same river twice, Heraclitus' phrase is, I believe, a brilliant evocation of the core reality of the right hemisphere's world. One will always be taken unawares by experience, since nothing being ever repeated, nothing can ever be known. We have to find a way of fixing it as it flies, stepping back from the immediacy of experience, stepping outside the flow. Hence, the brain has to attend to the world in two completely different ways, and in so doing, to bring two different worlds into being. In one, we experience the live, complex, embodied world of individual, always unique beings, forever in flux, a knit of interdependencies, forming and reforming wholes, a world with which we are deeply connected. In the other, we experience our experience in a special way, a represented version of it. This is now to the left hemisphere, containing now static, separable, bounded, but essentially fragmented entities, grouped into classes on which predictions can be based. This kind of attention isolates, fixes, and makes each thing explicit by bringing it under the spotlight of attention. In doing so, it renders things inert, mechanical, lifeless. But it also enables us for the first time to know and consequently to learn and make things. This gives us power. These two aspects of the world are not symmetrically opposed. So, invert inversions. I'm just going to give you a couple of samples of it, and then I'm going to open up to a little bit of storytelling from Andy. And then, as always, we'll go back to the group in our discussion broadly. So what do I mean by this, invert inversions? And I think you'll best understand it by examples. So right now, we live in a world that really loves this notion of what we call the Hegelian dialectic. It's the notion of the dialectic of opposites, are those things that negate each other as though, if not this, then that. And the idea that from these opposites, we can synthesize new positions. And so often you'll hear in the public dialogue where ecology and economy are posted as opposites. No, we have to do the politics, like we have to hold the economy, we have to take care of the economy. And no, we have to take the ecology, it's the ecology. And we put these things forward as though they're somehow equivalents. And this is where we get into trouble with the notion of inversions. They're not equivalents. They're actually asymmetries. They're actually representative, and this idea comes from a great cybernetic thinker named Francesco Varela, who passed way too early. He was a brilliant thinker, and he had a paper called Not One, Not Two, and he brought forward this idea of a cybernetic dialectic. It's a lovely paper, and I only want to take one little portion from it. And it was this notion of this idea of what was called imbrication. Imbrication is an interesting word. It's a type of nesting. It's where a thing folds back into itself, right? It's where the system of interests births something that emerges from it to then have it come back on itself and interact with itself. And in some ways, we know what imbrication is. Like, for example, the pregnant mother with the fetus in the womb is an imbrication, right? There is a life inside the life that is then born forth. And that's probably the more ideal metaphor of this notion. And he's saying, don't look at these things as opposites and equals. There's things in the world that are asymmetrical, of different orders, that one is set to birth the other. And if you take that order, there's a primary and it births the secondary. But if you reverse that and let the secondary birth the primary, this is the story of the master and the emissary from Nietzsche that Dr. McGilchrist recounted. We create a pathology, a teratogenesis, a monster, a tyranny, right? And so you're going to find that these things are all throughout the modern world. So as part of our notion of health design, we have to recognize that we have to invert these inversions, that what was originally a primary and secondary has now been made the secondary over the primary. And we've got to find a way to flip that back into its right positioning. So ecologies birth economies. Economies do not dictate the ecology. That's an inversion. And you can see what it's caused in the world. You can see the disruption of putting the economy primary, that inverting what birthed it, not giving that primacy to the ecology. The ecology needs to birth the economies that come back and support and regenerate it. An example I see in the office all the time is the parent-child imbrication that gets inverted. Right? In the modern world, many of us have been affected through our multi-generational traumas in our development. And although we walk around with these mature bodies and mature positions, all of us have immature nervous systems as a result of the mismatches of modernity. And so I see in my practice often these very mature children come in, children that look like almost they're precocious in how they talk and how they interact. And you're like, oh, you're a little adult. And then you dig a little bit, and almost inevitably, there's a story there. Perhaps it's alcoholism or mental illness or other types of trauma that are in the family. And that child has had to become a parent to themselves and to their parents, right? And this is a mental health pathology that's a family systems-based pathology. How do we invert that? It's very hard, actually, working with the individuals. This is an example where family systems therapy is a much more powerful lever in this case. As physicians, we do this inversion all the time. We make illness the primacy rather than health, right? We have a disease-based model, but it's health is the primacy. Homeostasis is the state of health, and we fall out of our balance, right? Back to 2 times ago when we talked about calibration and the etymology of the word sin being simply off target, right? Is that we find our way back. And so we recognize that if we put health as a primacy, what is disease? Well, there's symptoms that are simply calibrating us back and pointing our way back. How do we find our way back to health, right? So a health primacy is very different than a disease where you put a disease model as primacy. It's an inversion. One that we use all the time is the notion of process versus the endpoints, product, purpose, point. And so much of the world, right? What is the product? How are we going to cure the patient? What is the publication we're going to do? What is the plan for the city that we're going to obtain? How are we going to save the rainforest, right? We have this idea of these endpoints and we make them prime. This is the same with problems and solutions. We have a problem, let's find a solution. But I would argue that that's an inversion. Process is primary. And it's process that through these iterative folds and imbrications, the endpoints and the goals start to show themselves and emerge. So you'll see this throughout. A classic one I have in the office, rest and activity. Everybody thinks activity is the primacy. Do. I have to get it done. There's not enough time. I'm running out of time. But in health, I'm going to propose to you all the primacy, the primal state is rest. And from that, activity is born and emerges. You invert it, you will become diseased. You will see illness show up. So those are some examples of what I mean by inverting inversions. And I'm just going to kick it over to Andy, who's going to share some stories from both the realm of being an educator and an artist, I believe, or maybe not. Maybe I'll take it in an entirely different direction because it's not about the end point, it's about the process. But I'll flip it to Andy and then we're going to go to the group in a slightly different way tonight.
Inversions. I thought you said perversions, so I had an entirely different story written. All right. So when Bill started talking about inversions and said this was going to be the topic this week, I wrote this down. Sometimes when the train jumps its tracks, it's because it has wings. Or sometimes it's a horse, or sometimes insert whatever fear or paranoia or delusion or idea you want. Sometimes it just does that because the only way for the train to get back on track is to jump the tracks, because sometimes the track is driving the train and we wonder why we keep ending up in the same places. But artists have this kind of unique privilege. They transverse kind of interesting territory in space and time. And we use words like creativity and the imagination, or leaps of faith, or suspension of disbelief, or madness, or genius. And we use them to try to explain the positions that we assign to people that make things or create things, or describe situations that exist somewhere between practical relevancy and completely irrational. And maybe one of the reasons that artists exist is that they have to invert things. Because sometimes inverting things is the only way to discover that the inputs that have led you to the place of some messed up trajectory is by inverting the thing and by looking at it from a different perspective. So as a teacher, we always had these sort of golden rules in teaching. Always follow the curriculum, always post your expectations, always make clear outcomes or targets for students to follow. And another one, which not a lot of teachers and students followed, but was to let assessment drive learning. So every 3 or 4 years, we, as a teacher, have our own assessments. We go through it where we look at our practice. And that was one of those areas that I always got in a lot of trouble, because those things never made sense to me as an artist. Because I always thought, like, how would I know the outcome of a lesson? Or how would I set expectations before I've come to those outcomes? And why would I drive the curriculum if I'm trying to meet the needs of the students? Because I always have to adapt to whatever it is that's happening, because my students are obviously going to be different all the time, every day. And so I used to argue that if I let the design process work, then, and if that was my singular expectation, then the design itself would drive the learning, and I wouldn't know what the outcome was until the process was complete, which is really kind of a strange way to look at it. But the painting behind the wall where Bill is sitting is an example of that exact process. Bill and I sitting down to do a painting, we just have an idea of a thing called painting, but we don't know what it is that we're actually doing until the painting is finished. And invariably, it always does finish, and it invariably shows itself, and it's always surprising and unexpected and remarkable. So even just simple tasks, I was always hesitant to say, today we're making a clay pot, because just that simple framing of things dictated a kind of set of expectations that I didn't want, because it wasn't really about making a clay pot. I wanted the process to be much bigger, and something to be unknown amongst myself and the students, so that those kind of surprises would happen. So if we kind of follow education, and we all are experts in education because we've all spent a lot of time there, we probably know that education, modern education, sort of came about as a way to sort of serve industrialization. So we kind of moved from agricultural communities where people learned how to do the things that they did by watching their families, the community around them, and they learned by hands-on or just by mentorship. But when we have industry or business drive the expectations for education, then we end up with an inversion. We end up serving industrialization or capitalism or colonialism or some other big idea, rather than ideas of love and collaboration and relationship and beauty, which most of us would agree that those are the things as humans we want to be serving. And specifically, we want to be serving in terms of the things that we're learning. I said, as along the way, we adapt as industry changes. So, we used to have typing, and I used to teach typesetting and printmaking and all kinds of skills that would be used by artists in business. One of those courses was darkroom photography. And my principals would always argue, as we moved away from traditional darkroom photography, as we moved to digital photography and computers, my principals would argue that my smelly, unsafe, antiquated darkroom needed to be removed. And the argument was that we didn't need it because traditional photography was disappearing, and they needed the skills that they were going to need to be employed in the workforce. And my argument was always that, specifically with that particular course that I was teaching, or what they were experiencing, was awe and wonder and regret and loss. And along the way, they learned chemistry and physics and language and a whole host of other skills. And it happened particularly because of the kind of strange, almost ceremonial processes of the darkroom itself, of being in that dark space, and of the fragility of the materials that they were working with, and the magic. And so I saw over and over again a sense of awe and wonder on kids' faces when they put film into chemicals and came out with pictures. And I'd like to think that they became better doctors or engineers or parents or whatever it is that they became, because of the experiences that they had in there, rather than feeling, workplace stuff. So the idea is always, I guess, and this makes sense, that if you had a toolbox and I needed to do a job and I said, hand me a tool, as long as I could tell you what the job was, that you would know the right tool to give me. So you'd know to hand me a hammer or a saw. But we don't know what students want. So we end up just saying, well, we'll just give you a whole toolbox full of things. But of course, the idea that maybe instead of doing that we want to serve the development and then discovery of gifts and unique gifts, and how those gifts will be served within others, that's a really much more complicated question. Because sometimes being handed a saw when you needed a hammer is exactly the right thing that needs to happen. Or perhaps having no tools at all is exactly the right thing, because having no tools is actually the beginning of the process, or the germination of inventiveness and creativity and collaboration, because it forces me to ask for help or support or whatever it is. In other words, just as sort of Bill was saying about the hemispheres of the brain, I don't really know what the students need, nor do they really know what they need until those were put into those situations where they have to work through the problem. My experience in the classroom is that most of the things that happened, which were really powerful and life affirming or healing or healthy, didn't really happen definitely didn't happen because of the curriculum or because of the structure or the organization, but it almost happened despite those things. And they happened because moments showed themselves, and either I or they or we recognized those moments when they showed themselves. My daughter calls them cocoon moments, moments of transformation and heightened awareness and attention, and also instability, when things are like, unsure. And those usually precede moments of renewal, discovery, change. And change is really big because in education, I am change means I have learned, usually. So art. In art, we kind of think of that if we teach people the techniques, then they will have a language to express themselves. And we call those techniques the form. So teach students ideas and complex spaces for emotions, and that will drive their purpose. And we call that function. And in art, form always follows function. So it doesn't have to happen in that order. It can be reversed. But just like language serves meaning. Meaning doesn't serve language unless it's not serving, and then we have to change the language to serve it. So why does a kettle look like a kettle and not a chair? Because its function is to heat water. And its design, its form might imitate certain structural characteristics or compositional arrangements, or its impetus, its aesthetics might have actually been derived from some other beautiful object, but its purpose drives its form. And that's a really lovely idea in art, because those things are often happening together. Form and function are occurring together. And sometimes students come up with the forms of things, and then they work through the function of it, how it's going to function. And sometimes they come up with the function of things and they work backwards through the form of things. So a typical class, students ask themselves, what is the purpose of my art? And because it's usually, from an educational perspective, it's about marks. It's about assessment. It's about following rules. It's about just demonstrating technical abilities so that they can have the adulation of their peers and have a sense of self-esteem, which are all, good reasons to make art in a high school. But I like to think back to that sort of ancestral memory of these our grandmothers and grandfathers who crawled into caves in the dark to make visual images and marks that were symbolic or totemistic or literal. And the question why, given that we have such well-developed languages to explain ourselves to ourselves, do we still need this ancient way of communicating? And then what if my high school students came to class to make art because they wanted to discover something about the very nature of what it means to be a human? What would a successful art project like that look like? I have to ask myself. And I guess I would argue that it would look like anything, because its form would follow its function. It's that whatever it is that they made would be made because the very purpose of what they were doing was to find out about themselves as human beings. And that's not what they do. They come in and they make work because they're trying to fit a set of expectations or ideas for a school system that is driving them marks forward so that they can get good marks, so they can get into school, so they can go to school, so they can go into work, which is terrible, because as much as you argue against that with them, they truly understand that their marks are driving this path for themselves. So I guess as Bill was saying, what if doctors studied health instead of illness? What if we went to the doctor because we wanted prescriptions of health, not because we were sick? but because we wanted to feel good. What if doctors had to learn to read art and other deeply held subconscious languages as a prerequisite, just as important as they do for like Latin names? Because in order to treat a whole human, you would need something other than the name, order, form, and function of the parts. So you would need to know on a deep level that the profound poetry of anatomy is where health and wholeness is, that co-creation of form and function, or the form and function of ourselves. So anyway, that's sort of, I like to think that art is a kind of recipe for inversions. It provides a space in which we can move back and forth between those things to examine where things have become lost and when we're putting functions ahead of form. And you can see that throughout the history of art, how artists themselves have played in that language and have become stuck in that and have had to reinvent that whole process to get out of it. The reason we have a thing called postmodernism is because modernism reached a place where it could no longer sustain itself. And the education system, I think since most of us have had that experience of going through it, we truly understand that there is some disconnect between the idea of learning, as we would like it to be, and the way it is positioned for us as students. And of course, you can see the kind of harm that happens to our sense of selves and our sense of community and all that by being stuck in that inversion. So yeah, that's my that's my take from my perspective.
Sorry, trouble unmuting myself. So just we're gonna go break out into groups here in a second. But one of the things this really, as Andy mentioned, the painting behind us, Andy and I engage a process. And he's right. Of course, nominally we come in and say we have the start, say we're going to do a painting, but we could equally say we're going to do a dance with pigments. I mean, that would be as equally accurate. And we engage this process where we don't talk. We both paint on the same canvas at the same time. And we're moving about and in each other's ways and moving around. And, Andy will put something down and I'll paint over it, or I'll put down something and he'll scrape it away. And I'll think I just created some magnificence and it will, disappear in the next moment. And I'll see a smile on Andy's face as he knows he's laid down something nicely, and, I'll mischievously come and scratch it away. And we work at it, and we have one good painting, two good paintings, three good paintings, four good paintings. They all disappear. And then we have mud. And then we have the terror of, oh my gosh, where are we? We're lost in this confluence of flow and pigment and breaking of rules and muddiness. Everything is turning brown. And we work through. We continue to move. We commit to the process. We believe there will come. And at some point, we just stop. Because the painting shows itself. It always has. It always does. It just comes to an end, and we both know that we can't touch it anymore. But there was one little interesting part that I wanted to add to the story, is that I've never added before I give that explanation, about our paintings often. But what I've never said is every so often, and it's often Andy will do it, we know it's done, but we're not feeling right about it. There's something off still. Like we haven't come into the full rightness of relationship with this painting that we know is done, that is completed and shown itself to us. And Andy will come and he'll take it and he'll turn it and invert it upside down, or right side up, or whatever way you want to look at it. And then we go, there's the painting. We just weren't seeing it. It was inverted. We didn't know it until we turned it around. And now we see, now it's in right order. And there's a harmony in us, and there's a harmony between us, and there's a harmony with us in the painting. All right. So today I want to do things a little differently. The first three sessions, we've had a group conversation, and we started off sharing within a group. But today I want to actually do an act of imbrication. I want to do this notion of the proper primary and secondary. And I want the big group, which is primary. We're going to go into a nested form of some, 3 or so smaller groups, right? So the big group is going to birth these smaller groups called the breakout room. There's going to be a chance to talk on a more sort of smaller notion, and not just about invert inversions. You can start looking and saying, it would really be interesting if you are right from the get-go saying, are there inversions in my life? Is this a reason where I am in dis-ease? And where does it lie? Is the inversion in me? Is it in the family? Is it in the community structure? Is it in the societal structure? Is it in the epistemology the societies hold? Is it in my structure, my relation to the natural world? What level is the inversion at and thus affecting me, because we're all part of these embedded systems? Or you can talk about the other koans that we've held. What is health? Act to know. About and within. Choose your prepositions wisely. And if you've been listening, you'll know 2 of the koans are already speak to this notion of primacy and secondary, the right order, the changing of inversions. Remember, we said act to know versus know to act. We live in a world that says we have to know, we have to research, we have to understand, and then we'll plan it out and act. I'm proposing in our health design and language that that's an inversion, that the primacy is really act first, such that you can learn and gain knowledge anew. Act to know. With the about and within, right? You'll never from about ever get within. But from within, you can understand things about, right? It's a different position. We're saying put with, there's times that we want to know about something, but do it from the within position, right? Not the reverse. Don't do the inversion. And then today, again, when we talked about McGilchrist's thesis of the right and left brain and their ways of seeing the world, they're not equal. They're asymmetrical, right? The primacy is the right brain is the brain of wholeness, interconnectivity, and flow. And the left brain is the brain of parsing and parts. The left brain is the emissary. The right brain is the master. The left brain is born of the wholeness and then comes back and serves the specific to the general, right? And to recognize this isn't a battle. This is a flow, right? From the one emerges the other, which feeds back and moves the whole process forward. So we've got 4 koans. We've got our stories. We've got our histories. We've got our experiences. Greg, can you take us to, let's say, 3 breakout rooms of 5? We'll make sure that there's nobody alone. Maybe there might be 1 breakout room of 3, or it might do 2 of 4.
Let me see that.
And throw us into the rooms too, Greg. Andy and I, we don't want to be separate. We want to be part of that conversation.
Okay. From what I can see, I don't have the controls of the breakout.
I should have given you the whole host things. Okay, I see the breakout ones here. I've got them. So assign automatically. I'm going to create 3 breakout rooms here.
No problem, Don.
And I think we are good. Let's go create. And that should do it. And open all rooms. We're going to go about 10 minutes. And then whatever we take from this conversation for about 10 minutes, we're going to come back to the group. And so from our groups, it's going to feed back to the group. This is that process of imbrication, emergence, and feedback, that iteration. And we'll see where that conversation goes. All right. See you guys in 10 minutes. It says in progress. Great. Popping in. Oh, hey, Andy, you here still?
we weren't sure, but we decided to come back into the room. That's why we're here. Oh, we can't hear you, Bill.
Oh, just as well. We were recording and I was ranting about how I was, you gave me a fright that you were back. I thought, oh, I'm back in the breakout room. It's the Groundhog Day version. It's endless. Yeah, my Zoom learning curve. All right, I think they should be coming back.
You should be able to.
Sorry, it's 30. They got 34 seconds. So
Yeah, that's right.
yeah. Well, it gives them a countdown. Okay, we are learning here. So just as we're waiting for them to come back, let me just thank you guys for your participation in the breakout room. We're going to be trying different things. We're going to be, Sean Park isn't here with us, but he's going to be doing some group building things in the future as well. And we're going to try to keep this thing, we're going to try to keep shifting it up in different ways.
Okay.
Right, here we are coming back.
Okay.
All right, welcome back. Oh, Perrin, hello, I can see you. There's a camera on. Good. Nice to see your face. I know Chris remains faceless because he has no camera there. And
it's not that I'm faceless. It's just I don't have a camera to show it.
Again,
I have a face, honest.
I believe you. I believe you. I know it to be true. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back from our room. And so you'll notice that I have often said, okay, what was the harvest from last time at the start of this? And again, we have this sort of fractal nature to this sort of thing. And now we have these smaller rooms. And the point is we have to be able to bring back not just the stories that we don't necessarily do the specifics of what we talked about, but it could have been the spirit of it, the experience of it, what that got moving in you, what even now in these few minutes out of the breakout room of reflection. So now we're going to go back to the group as a whole, put up the hand. The Koan is inverting inversions. Of course, all the other ones we've ever spoke about are up for grabs. The one thing I just want to say, and this is going to be my little sharing from the breakout room, I'm noticing that people are developing, like what I said to Michael, a good sniffer, right? Like a bloodhound. Something's amiss here. He, if I could just borrow Michael's story for a second, he said, the cooking at hospitals, there's something not right with hospital food for patients. Sniffing, right? Oh yeah, something, it doesn't, this isn't how grandpa would have done it. What's happened here, right? And now it might not be that it's an inversion. As you see a lot with it, as we do these koans over the coming weeks, there's many things that you can start to look at, right? Maybe it's about an about within issue that we talked about last time. Maybe the people at the hospital never eat the food they cook. If they had to eat it, they'd all of a sudden be within the reality of their cooking and it wouldn't be about cooking for them anymore, right? So, but again, the sniffer is important. You don't have to know it yet, but I want everybody to start going in their lives, in their families, in their communities, in their work, in the society they live in the ecology. What do you see? What's not right? What doesn't feel right? What is aesthetically out of balance? What isn't beautiful, right? So it didn't taste right, the hospital food. It's aesthetically something was wrong, right? It's not about the nutrition. Maybe the nutrition, the numbers were fine, but the smell, something, and not just the smell of the food, but the smell of there's something amiss here. So that's my harvest that I want to bring back. So hands, I've already seen them there. Oh, Chris, you're teasing us with it. Oh, the hands back up.
Sorry, it was a test.
All right, jump in.
Zoom looks like it has updated something on the computer I'm using, so it took me a minute to find where the raise hand function was. I really enjoyed this change in the process today and being able to speak in a smaller group and get a little more comfortable with a few individual people. I thought that was fantastic, very enjoyable. For me, the biggest takeaway I have is everybody, for the most part, in our smaller group, in our conversation, we're dealing with a lot of concerns with regards to process over product or product over process, and how everything is product driven. And when we're able to turn around and look back and look at how this has changed our own personal processes in regards to our hobbies, our work, our schoolings, our whatever, just that a lot of that process is getting lost, and the goal is really trying to come back and find a way back into being very process driven. So I spoke about, and I mentioned it a couple of weeks back, shifting writing to writing by hand versus writing in a word processor. Sebastian, who was also in our small break room, discussed some information with regards to some poetry and realigning poetry. And Olga talked about how when she was in high school, she enjoyed the process of math versus the product of math. So it was very interesting to gain this knowledge and hear about these experiences with everybody who we were individually chatting with over the entire group.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah. There's again, if I can just, as we go along, if I can just identify inversions. Prose before poetry is an inversion. Poetry is the primary, right? A poetic, linguistic expression, right? What it was originally language, there's two languages. Was it pragmatic language first, or was it born of awe and wonderment? Well, we can't go back there and know the initial moments, but I would like to choose to believe that languaging was gasps and breaths of both awe and wonderment and terror. By the way, that's a triad. They all live together. You don't get one without the other. So I'm going to propose today that poetry before prose. And then you learn to make your prose poetic, right? Then you have a craft and an art in your writing. All right, other hands, other sharings. What's moving in you guys now? We can get off the topic again. It's not about being on the topic, right? That's not the point of this. What's moving in you guys in all of this? Including things that might be frustrating, things that are stuck, things that are not moving, all of that.
Can I say something, Bill?
Please jump in. Yeah.
I just want to reflect on the question you asked last one time I was on about what is health? Was that the question? What is health? So the thing is that when we talk about health, right, we like to define it as it's this entity on its own. Like we see, and I think the notion of health arises out of the notion of disease. That you can define a disease process, right? So when you define a disease process, then you have to define well then what is health? If this is disease, what is health? But I think that the whole approaching it from that paradigm, I see it. I don't know what the right word is. I see that as flawed. And the reason is because I don't think you should necessarily define health in terms of the opposite of disease, because health is homeostasis. It's our natural state. It's how we are, born into this world, right? In a state of health. But, health has so many factors, right? It's not just about nutrition. It's not just about movement, adequate sleep. It's about so many things. It's actually about everything. It's everything. And that's what health is. Like our thoughts, our emotions, our relationships, are we living, Andy was talking about in our breakout room about asking a question about cultivating gifts. So are we cultivating our gifts? Are we living our higher purpose? Are we, so when I look at, I don't necessarily like the word health. I like the word life, because health and life are inseparable. So when you look at health, you have to look at life. Life in terms of what is life? what is your life? Is your life defined by what society dictates, what your religion dictates, what the education you've gotten dictates, what marketing and advertising dictate, what all these external influences dictate? Is that what life is? Or is life something intrinsic that is a lot deeper than what we see on the surface? Is life undefinable? Can we even define what life is? And in that sense, can we truly define what health is? I don't even know the answer to that question. Can we truly define what life is? Like, I mean, you know, you look at a tree or a plant and you know that it has life, right? A blade of grass has life, not in the same sense as a human being or an animal has life, because you can see its features, you can see its expressions, you can see it moving. But, you know, even, you know, the tiniest of single-celled organisms, I mean, you know, there is life there. So I think that's the question you need to ask when you ask what is health. You need to ask, what is life? So that's all I wanted to share.
So thank you, Numan. And, you know, just sort of two things that come to mind right away, you know, with that is, let's start with the later half of it. I'll go back to the first part, but let's start with the end, which is, and this is again, the tyranny of language. And so Andy and I sort of play with these things where, and you'll see in our writing or, you know, on our website, we'll put capital letters where you think, why are they capitalizing that? Because we capitalize anything that's a facet of the primary wholeness of being, right? The primary wholeness of being. So even beyond life, like it's the entirety of the whole, which of course is living, because there is life, so the whole is living. All of its animacy is just our distinctions, but you know, the wholeness of life in the universe as a universal whole. And then we say, well, what are the facets of that uncomprehensible, unknowable mystery? And then we start talking about capital H health, not the inversion, small h health, like healthcare. You know, capital L life, capital L love, capital W wisdom, capital B beauty, capital S sacred, to distinguish it from those inversion uses of the word. And so part of what we're doing here is exactly that. I'm glad you brought it up, because we're trying to find the shared poetic language that when you say health and I say health, we both mean the life that it comes from, you know, that it cycles back to. Like we're in some ways learning to make secret pacts of agreement here. You know, that when you say this word and I say it, we mean it with the awe and wonderment and the numinous magnitude and power that they have, right? So I love that because it's a way to find our kinship, right? You know, like, oh, we're not oddballs. There's others that speak the language in the marketplace, like, you know. The other part though, that why do we do a disease-based model? Well, it's exactly that you hit it. It's easy to define, right? And so look for the inversions. The inversions are always easy to define because they're inevitably reductionist, part-based, separated out, decontextualized, boxed in. You know what I'm saying? It's lazy, right? Like it's got an addiction, right? Because it's like, oh, I can define that. Right, I can define and that's why we have all these goals. And like, I can define my goals in my 5-year plan. And I can define it, right? And that's why we have this pull to these inversions. But yet you're right. Yet the healing, for example, in our work is always that intangible that you can't define. What just happened in the room here? I don't know. You know what happened. I know what happened. We know what happened, but I can't. The best I'm going to do is make a painting or turn to poetry or just sit in knowing silence, you know, knowing that we somehow deeply know, but can't define. So I just love all the points that you went there Andy, I'm seeing you in your pensive, reflective state.
Yeah, I was thinking. I mentioned a little bit there about the fact that, like, I always think about our roots as artists in these caves. These caves are not easily accessible. It was a dangerous activity to go deep into these, and they weren't on the edge. They were, quite a ways down, and they were pitch black, dark, and and we went into these things to make, cave bears there, and we went down there to make work. And I remember seeing a documentary a few years ago. They were trying to measure these what are called trailings, which is just essentially people would put their hand against the wet cave wall and drag their fingers down the mud in a straight line, and it wasn't it wasn't elaborate, and they weren't drawing. They were just literally like doing this on the wall. And in one cave, it was about 30,000 years ago, they were looking at these trailings, and they were trying to determine something about the people, and so they thought that they were looking at many years of people coming in and doing this activity, and it turned out that almost all of them were done by a little girl. And one of the big realizations that they had in this, she was probably around 10 years of age, was in the process of doing it, that they realized that somebody must have been holding a light for her, so that she could do it, because she would do this with both hands on the wall. And we don't know why she was doing it. We don't know why she was making those marks, but I think that their instant of it and the seeing of it was an expression of the profound poetry of life. And it wasn't that they figured out the width of the fingers and figured out the age of the person that was doing it, and they figured out that it was the same person, and they figured out that they were right-handed. It wasn't that. It was actually the sort of the moment when they recognized that in order to do that, somebody was holding a light for them, and that the whole thing was bound in that relationship, in those connective tissues. And I think, I look at the painting behind Bill, and I think about us, 30,000 years later, getting together, working together to draw lines on this piece of paper. And, like, what are we doing? What are we doing? And as Bill said, we're trying to find a language to explain life. And the complexity of that. And as Bill's saying, those capital letter things, the life is also the existence that I had before I existed, and the existence that I'll have after this existence. Like, in a whole universe, it holds all of that too. And so in a conversation about life, it's not just a beginning and an end. It's also like that whole totality. And of course, all of that is when we enter into that like mythopoetic realm where, the most profound and powerful things about our existence and our consciousness show themselves. And they often show themselves in the smallest ways. Fingers on a wet wall in the dark. So yeah, I love what you're saying. And I was thinking the same thing as you were talking. I was like, yeah, health and disease is really just a way of nesting the idea of life, because they're just expressions of the same thing, right? They're just undulations back and forth through that movement. That was my my thought.
And just the one last wisdom to what Newman said and what you just said there, Andy, like understanding health and disease. I love it. I always go back to this. Why the Bushman reason? Why have we been given illness? Why do we get sick? it's to remember to go and dance again. I just love that cycle. Like you said, that undulation, that illness is an expression of our greater health. It's part of a wisdom. We move in and out if we learn to move with it and not get stuck. I know there's more hands there. I know that there's stirrings to be shared.
Yes, Alexander had his hand up earlier.
Okay.
Yeah. I was struck. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch his name, but with the name and we were in the same break room together.
Numan.
Yeah, sorry, my initials show up. I don't know why, but it's Numan.
No worries. I was struck by the connection to an idea that I've been playing around with, that we might not be able to define health or know health or know life, but we can live life. I mean, the tree lives life. I live life. I'm doing it right now. So are you. That's a kind of definition. And that goes back to act to know too, that you know by doing, by living, by in that relationship between the girl drawing her hand down the wall and the person holding the light. And Andy and Bill, I want to ask you two, who holds the light for you?
Good question. I'll just do a quick one. My mom was an artist. She's passed away now, 7 years. My dad was is a writer and photographer. And they introduced me to poetry and art and aesthetics. And they were terribly human as well. And so, yeah, so whenever I'm making art, I'm aware that my great-grandfather was an artist, and that somewhere down the line there was probably other artists. And I like to think that, when we go into ceremony, we often will say all my relations, and we say thanks to our ancestors, and part of that is just like all the trees and life and all the living things that I share this existence with. But it's also like a recognition that my mom, even in her passing, still holds that light for me, like still inspires me, still teaches me, still informs who I am, and my dad the same, right? Like, and because it's an active conversation, because I talk to my mother, even though she's passed, and even though my grandparents have passed and I talk to them, they continue to hold the light for me. And I in turn have a responsibility for holding the light for them too, to mention their names here and to, or to mention their lives here to you, so that they are, it's renewed. Yeah.
Well, Alex,
and Bill.
Yeah, the one of the things I just think about is I second what Andy said, that impulse towards the ancestors and the notion of all my relations is that we're all supported to be here in the entirety of the ecological web, and the ancestral web. We're all here because of our successful ancestors, right? We're all here because we come from lineages that managed to live in alignment with the world. I mean, we are, in the homogeneous, a 2 million year. They were the light bearers of 2 million years that brought us here. But in very practical terms, and we were reminded of this in things like the Anishinaabe ceremony that Andy and I have had the pleasure and the privilege of being able to go to. We're always reminded, you're here because there's somebody at home, right? So I'm here now in the midst, and I do like to think of this as my artistry, right? The art of conversation, the art of building community, the art of expression, the giving and the feeling. I'm here in the midst of this art right now. Well, let me first thank because of all of you, right? Like in this moment, I don't mean that in a trivial, patronizing sense. Like there's no conversation unless we show up. So let me first express my gratitude. And this is a good practice we should start to maybe incorporate into our culture here, is to, recognize from the start a sense of gratitude that we've made the choice to come together yet again. So you're my light bearers in this moment. My wife is at home. She's making a dinner for us tonight. My children are getting older, but they still have emotional need. Any given night, there's the crisis of teenage and early 20s angst and, things that come forward. She's there fielding that. And, and she has an ailing parent. She is the support that lets me be here. Right. And so these are really, I'm so glad that you brought this up, because these are the really important. Now, what is the primary, right? It's not what we're doing. This is the secondary. Right? The art, the chance to do this artistry is the second. It's what's come out. It was what was birthed. The primary is the support that's holding this. So Alex, I'm going to pass like a baton or a torch, because it's more like a torch, a cave torch. That question to everybody. What's your light? Who's holding the light for you? Not necessarily just tonight in this conversation, but in your life's work, in your efforts, in your movement. What has lit the path? What has illuminated the path such that you can be here as you are in this living moment? I want to put that torch out, or again, as always, take it, go any direction you want. Michael?
Yes, I think the light for me as a Christian is Jesus. I mean, we live in a rather secular age, and I understand that as humans, you mentioned the word sin before, that we're deeply mortal. We have a lot of faults, all of us, and then I think that we need to look at respecting all the faiths. I mentioned I was in a transpersonal therapy group where my colleagues were Buddhists, people Wiccan, native spirituality. I think they're all valid, because when I think of the word higher power that Newman mentioned, and higher purpose, I think of higher power. And for me, my spiritual beliefs motivate me to try and serve others. As Andy said, use whatever skills I might have to try and help others. And I know Dr. Sutherland in past courses has talked about how our talents or skills and abilities are not here necessarily for us, but to help others. I also feel, too, that it gives my life a sense of purpose. That, for example, I had to get some surgery on my neck, and maybe my pain is to serve some other purpose. Maybe it's to talk to the lady next door who's dealing with just having diabetes and is really suffering, and we listen to each other. We mentor to one another. I want to mention something that's happening to me right now, and that is when I came into the conversation tonight, I honestly felt like my energy level was about 10%. I did not react well to the anesthesia. I'm extremely tired, but I feel energized. I feel a life spark. So when Newman mentioned about life and health, it's so true, because if we don't have a purpose, if we don't have any fire within, we don't have desire, we don't have spark, we don't have interest, we're really not living. We're lacking something. So what I love about the discussion here is that this could go in so many tangents, and it's not like a kid in a candy store. I don't know which one to pick. There's so many to go off. I mean, I've been watching a series on CNN about Abraham Lincoln, and he's incredibly poetic, and yet his prose is remembered because of his poetry, and people are still quoting him all these many years later. I can also relate to Andy as a retired teacher. in that I had projects going on where I didn't know where the hell they were going to go. And that's good for me because I like the good beginning, middle, and end, something linear. But I kind of let it go open and say, well, I'm not talented in every area. Let's build this project and let's see where it takes us. And it's not necessarily a skill set of mine to be artistic. So the kids would actually be mentors in some ways. You know, I would look at the overall process, but they would use their individual skills to form small groups like we did tonight. Those are just some thoughts that come to mind. But I want to thank everybody. It's intriguing discussions, and there's so many gems and bits and pieces there that we could take and go. And one last thing is, we live in a world where we don't talk about stuff. It seems to me that feelings and emotions are intrinsic here. In the world, people, I mean, I love sports and talk about the weather too. I honestly do. But sometimes we're afraid to reveal ourselves, to say, what am I feeling? I might be feeling vulnerable right now. And that's okay if there's trust. And then that's how you build strong relationships that endure. Thank you.
I love the closing there. Mike, I want to use the closing to go back to your opening. This is how we build strong relationships that endure. And I'm going to put this one out. You guys can fight me on this one, but I actually think this is an inversion in our society and the world of this time. And Michael's sharing just made me think of it. So, you know, we often hear this expression in this day and age. This is new in my lifetime, by the way. I've seen it over the last, I'm going to say 30 years, but really started picking up speed about 20 years ago. And in the last 10, it's just sort of the status quo acceptance where people go, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. But I want to actually say that I think that's actually an inversion. If you go back to the 10-year-old girl in the cave paintings, right? That was an experience, an expression of religiosity, awe, wonderment, the numinous, humility, respect, and to recognize that it wasn't born out of, she may have had an individual impulse, but back to the point about who held the light, it was supported in a cultural and community holding, right? The culture and the community, which it's not an individual spiritual experience, it's a held religiosity of shared value and belief and view, born again of a deeper ecology, of a land of experience, born of a place and a time, right? Again, imbrications among imbrications, ness within ness, all folding over. And out of that holding, that 10-year-old girl was able to have her individual personal spiritual expression as a painting on the wall. So I'm going to put out the notion that this idea that when you hear it, and you'll hear it everywhere, you've probably said to yourself, I've said it. Well, you know, at times, oh, I'm spiritual. You know, I'm more spiritual. I'm not, you know, I'm not, and don't get me wrong. That's not that you can't critique a structure, right? And the notion of the politics and the different types of things that come up in these, in the expressions. I suspect that many religious structures have many inversions in them. You know, like there's nuance in all of this, but in the broadest of terms, I'm going to use the word religiosity. Religiosity is prime. It is the level of the community that allows that to be held and put forth. And the spiritual expression then is able to come forth in an individual way. You can debate, you can push back on that if anybody wants to. I don't want to take Greg's job away. I know he's looking there so keenly. He's got it. He's got to see it in his eyes. Go ahead, Greg.
It's all good. It's all good. Norman had his hand up for a while.
Yeah, just I want to share an inversion. So we look at the illusion of matter. So you look at matter, right? I mean, look, the world around us, our physical bodies, it all seems so real, right? So solid. You know, if you break down matter into its fundamental building block, you know, it's the atom, right? You break that down further, subatomic particles. What is it? It's empty space. There's nothing there. It's just a vibrational frequency. So this whole, I mean, I see an inversion there, like matter seems so real, but it's really empty. But yet, where did everything arise from, right? The universe we live in, they say it arose from a cataclysmic event called the Big Bang. So what was the Big Bang? Basically, it was something arising out of nothingness, out of emptiness. pure emptiness. Just think about that. I mean, you can't think about it because the mind can't grasp that emptiness. This whole notion of Buddhist notion of emptiness, that emptiness really is not emptiness. There is something there that we can't define. So I just wanted to share that real quick. I know I don't want to take up a lot of time because other people want to share, but this felt I wanted to share that inversion. So
I just quickly found something I just heard today. I'm listening to the audio version now again of the Master and the Emissary. So I love that to just I'm going to give you a little reading. So again, about matter, is it primacy? Or is it secondary, right? And McGilchrist writes, is consciousness a product of the brain? The only certainty here is that anyone who thinks they can answer this question with certainty has to be wrong. We have only our conceptions of consciousness and of the brain to go on. And the one thing we do know for certain is that everything we know of the brain is a product of consciousness. That is, scientifically speaking, far more certain that consciousness itself is a product of the brain. It may be or it may not, but what is an undeniable fact is the idea that there is a universe of things in which there is one thing called the brain and another thing called the mind, together with scientific principle that would allow the one to emerge from the other. These are all ideas, products of consciousness, and therefore only as good as the particular models used by that consciousness to understand the world. And maybe, when we post this, you can go back and listen. It's just mind-blowing to me, right? Like, all that we know is that we have this experience called we're conscious. And in our conscious experience, we experience something called matter. And, I love another thing McGilchrist goes on to find. What is matter? It's the conscious experience of something pushing back. That's all we know. Is it actually a thing? Is it a something? We just know we have, with all the other qualities of experience that we have, cold, heat, all of these emotional and feeling states, that we have this experience in consciousness called these things push back. But it doesn't necessarily make them things. They're experiences. So I think that you're onto it. I think that's an inversion, right? At best, we see that matter is the secondary birthing of all that we can know for sure is that there is this thing called consciousness. Beyond that, we don't know. And I fought that for a while. I was a battler to say, no, conscious is emergent from matter, right? That was my state to very recently. Just now am I opening up to a more panpsychic perspective that maybe consciousness is fundamental and primary. But I have to, again, you have to find your way to it. Yeah, thank you, Newmore.
I love the idea that that we're thinking about the Big Bang or talking about the Big Bang. And of course, in order for us to do that, the Big Bang must have occurred, and all of the shifts of energy to get to this state for us to have this conversation. So really, if it didn't happen, we don't happen. But because we're able to talk about this thing that occurred, really the Big Bang is about the emergence of this moment, this consciousness that we're experiencing right now and talking about. And so your lovely Ouroboros here, where the in order for us to be able to talk about the universe has to birth us.
It's lovely. It's lovely.
Yeah.
Olga, you had your hand up for a semisecond.
Who?
Me?
Yes. Did you hit it by mistake?
I must have hit it by mistake.
All right, then Perrin.
Oh, just do it.
Yeah, perhaps you have something on your mind. He was unconscious. It's an inversion, in fact. The fact you lowered it means you had it up.
Yeah.
We won't suffer too much. Perrin, jump on in.
Okay, yeah.
You'll give a moment. Yeah.
So yeah, great conversation. I have lots of reflections, and I'm just trying to think about where to start. And so I think I'll just kind of follow up on the last sort of discussion from the the McGilchrist, or is that how you say it, McGilchrist?
McGilchrist.
Yeah. So one of the points that was brought up earlier was this idea of, kind of the separation and, kind of being in flux versus, sort of understanding, sort of fragments in order to kind of control them. And there was this kind of question of like, sort of knowledge being power. And I think, my reaction to that is that I think that sort of that aspect of kind of dividing knowledge into sort of compartments such that we can understand things, it's really more, it's not really an action of power, it's more of an action of control. Whereas I think that, being in the flux is really what is empowering, right? When we can be, sort of present and engaged and responsive. But then I think, like in order to do that, we need to really find, sort of wholeness in ourselves, right? Like, I don't know that I think that that it's a hard thing. It's a hard activity to do, especially, for example, if you think about, kind of creative production, right? Which we've, been talking about quite a bit. And I think, you mentioned this idea about like, is it, when do you know that it's right? Right. And that idea of kind of, being in wholeness as, ourselves as creative producers in order to produce, it's really, like there's almost like a full, lifetime of work to be done to get to that point. Right. And I think, like being in flux within the system, you're working through all of these, you're working against all of the sort of traps and tricks and obsessions. And as Newman said, sort of dictates that the system is setting up for you. Right. And so you're almost, you have to kind of go through this like juggling act of, or obstacle course of getting around all of those things in order to kind of reproduce something within the system, or to produce something within the system that is, as you sort of read from the Daniel Christian Wall quote, that is in fact regenerative, right? And then I guess that's kind of where I get stuck. I think, that, going back to this question about what is health, Newman again sort of raised this point about homeostasis and how we're sort of born into the world in health. And I think, maybe I would, push back on that and say, like, everybody has different genetics, everybody has different families, as Bill sort of mentioned, and different sort of experiences of trauma within those families. And so there are all of these other sort of aspects to kind of build out about the system when we understand how we're enabling health within a system, right? So we're looking at all of these kinds of tricks and traps created by society. We're looking at all of the like baggage that each, individual kind of is working with within that system in order to find wholeness. I guess I'll talk about, that sort of, I'll just, sort of reference that, piece about, the poetic, which a number of people have brought up, because there are other authors who, Martin Heidegger, as well as Ingold, they come back to that idea as well, about how do you kind of find, basically the measure of the universe? And both of those authors sort of look to poetry as well. Like if you're sort of trying to like, create a regenerative system, their sort of sentiment is that is also kind of poetic in some way, and that we should be referencing poetry in order to do that. And then I was also sort of, Andy's sort of discussion about, kind of the dark room and, these kinds of earlier techniques that we've lost.
Microphone was lost?
Oh, one of the things that we gain through some of those techniques is, I think, precision and care in process, right? Because you really need to kind of, sort of plan your steps in advance. And when I was first taught to draw, our teachers had a rule that we couldn't erase anything. And so, you had to kind of, plan everything in advance before you put it down on paper, before you, in a sense, kind of put it into the system. And I think that's one thing that we gain. There's sort of, that kind of commitment to what it is that we're creating within this, or creating or producing, within the system. And I'll end there. Thank you.
I've got one I don't want to call it a question for you, Perrin. I want to put it out as it's an inquiry. It's something different than a question. So I love the sharing. I love again. I love the articulation. I love the clarity. I love what you put forth. So let's just take two metaphors that we've worked on over the last 2 weeks that you've been with us. There was the about versus within. And then today with Iain McGilchrist, we had the flow of Heraclides River, and then that necessity of the right brain, and then the necessity of the left hemisphere to either step out or to elevate above it such that we could contain hard and parse so that we could get a grip on the world. So if we put by analogy the notion of first person and second person speech, where first person speech is in some way within and in some way a kind of live feed and dictation from in the flow of the moment. So that's first person. And then second person is that I'm going to step out, I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to be at a distance from the flow. And so we switch into that you could, you may, you could see that here versus the I position. I am in this moment, working through these things in me. What would it be for you in your languaging? I guess it is a question in the sense that what would have to shift for you to go from the you to the I, from the about to the within, from outside to inside the river? You don't have to. I'm not saying one is better or one is worse. I'm not pushing you towards it. I'm just saying if you had the option, a more clear option that you could pick, I could do this one or I could do that one, but the awareness that you could be in either at any moment, what would any of us have to do to shift from that? I mean, let me put the question out to all of us. I mean, Perrin is, I think, helped to sort of raise it up just in the clarity of the speech. But Perrin, let me give you a chance to reply. Like, is there, or not? I just wonder how that, just how that even resonates.
Yeah, so I'll respond. And I think this question, I think there's more to, when you sort of look at it from the perspective of a visual artist or any kind of artist, really, there's more to, the definitions than just about versus within. Mm-hmm. Because I think a lot of times, for example, and in my own work, we use, for example, like visual expression as a way to get out of, kind of political language and academic language, right? And so sometimes you can actually dive into or more deeply, sort of into an engagement with difficult issues by changing the form of expression, right? But that's not necessarily, working in and about versus a within, because a lot of times, people will say, as I've, sort of stated in past discussions, that, sometimes visual artwork is really kind of a stepping out of the system to kind of reflect back in order to capture the spirit of it. And so, but I think that, so to answer your question about how do you get within, I'll answer that, kind of from the perspective of, I guess as an artist as well. I think for me, it is actually that action of trying to kind of perceive a pattern, right? Rather than looking at like kind of like the mechanics of what is happening in a situation, I think. And then whether like I resonate with that pattern in some way.
Yeah. Let me just put myself on the hot seat for a second. And let me ask you guys a little poll. Can you tell the difference? I'm making an assumption. Again, let's make a difference from when I'm just speaking badly. Let's put that aside, like when I'm just mumbling in some way. But from where I'm in my articulation, I'm articulating well. And that's a really important word, because articulation refers to your proprioception, your joint movement. Joint on literally our articulations are the movement of our joints. So this is our manipulators, our tactile, the 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 movements of moving a world. So if I'm articulating my speech well, I'm in my left hemisphere, right? I'm being a good articulator. I'm being clear with my prose. Versus the times that I'm making an assumption, but I'm hoping that every so often I hit a note that may be inspiring. And I wanted to think about that word, right? And inspire, the notion of breath, in spiritus, right? In a movement, right? In the ancient thought that, like the muses are the idea that the through you, not of you, right? Which is, again, a right hemisphere position. Again, there's not a right or a wrong in this, right? There's a right and a left, but there's not a right and a wrong. I could be in the one and I can be in the other, but let me ask you guys this, and you could just nod the head or raise the hand. Can you tell the difference? And of course, the answer I would think would be yes, right? Because you're responding in kind to either the communication of the one or the communication of the other. When I was just pushing on Perrin there, I'm pushing on all of you and I'm pushing on myself, that we're just aware that when we're in our articulation and in our clarity and in our precision, in our languaging, it's wonderful, it's artful, it's skillful, it's a lovely thing. And when we are not necessarily in our skill, it's small a artful, but the art is moving through us, that we're in our inspiration, which can be clunky and ugly and emoting and raw and all of these things, that we're just aware of the difference as we shift back and forth within it. And the part of the invite to everybody in these talks is to gently, and maybe it's just a toe at a time, is to push into these different ways of participating, viewing, receiving, and engaging this dual world that we're always creating with each other, and trying to bring back the right balance of the right births the left. Always looking to make sure that we're not inadvertently falling into an inversion of just pure dominance by the left. We're not kicking the left out. The left is informing. The left is helping move this cycle around. But again, the notion of a homeostatic balance, of on target, of finding our way back in. Perrin, is that the old hand or a new hand that just popped up?
Yeah, I just had one more thing to add.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, so I think, so one thing that artists also sort of sometimes do is media fast, right? They say to kind of get into their own creativity, they need to actually close themselves out from, kind of the chaos of really like public life, right? And that's something that I definitely do. And so that's why I'm sort of saying there's also, more distinction than being, just about or within, because in order to go within, right, sometimes we need to kind of quiet our space, right? So clear out, all of the political debates or all of, the kind of dictates of society and, popular media and such.
I love that. One of the, I remember I gave that sort of list of inversions I had noted in my own life and practice. And the last one I didn't share because I thought it was a little too esoteric, but you hit to it. And here's the one which is stillness births movement. It's not the opposite, where we are all running around like frantic chickens with our heads cut off with the hope that somehow we'll find relaxation and stillness. It's the stillness that births the movement. Anyway, just that last little sharing of yours made me, you just sort of think back to that. So, yes, so thank you. Yeah. Greg, where are we at?
Yeah, Chris, right up.
Thank you. Just a tiny little observation in my own life popped into my head when you mentioned first person versus second person and perspectives. It popped into my head, and it's something that I find interesting. And I mean, take it for what it is. I find when I'm writing, personally more comfortable writing in the first person, having my main character as a narrator. But I've also realized that I've done this a number of times, and at no point in any of my first person works have I actually given the narrator a name. The narrator doesn't introduce themselves. The narrator never gets called by a name from anybody, from any of the other characters. And it's an interesting observation that has kind of just popped into my head, that for whatever reason I don't name a narrator when I'm writing in the first person. I can see Greg on my screen and the expressions as he's trying to ponder this.
I love the observation. Again, and just sort of mirroring back to parents sharing. I love that there's artists here. I love that there's visual artists. I love that there's writers. I love that, and even if you're not necessarily a formal artist, I love that that everybody in here takes an artistic approach. I love Alex's movement jazz, his art, and the session he's come through. So this, I think the very fact that art, and it's no mistake that Andy and I are holding our polls here, on our site, on our podcast and things. I'm introduced as Dr. William Sutherland, and Andy is introduced as artist Andrew McClure, and that synergy of perspective. Really at the end, though, if we were to make, again, what is the right position? What is the right position in Andy and I's positioning, right? It's not physician then artist, right? Even medicine, we used to call them medical arts buildings, not medical science buildings. You go down to any old downtown building, it says medical arts building, not medical science building. The right anti-inversion is the artist first, and then the physician clinician is birthed of that. Are the scientists, same thing. And science may be a little different. Philosopher first, then birthing the methodologist called the scientist, right? We're in those last few minutes, and this is where I know those last hand people like to just jump in and rush for the last few minutes. Is there any other last sort of final thoughts as we're coming into our wrap up?
I want to throw this out there just to think about, because I haven't formulated the whole idea yet, but just as Chris was talking, we sort of think about the fact that that life is primacy, and then story follows life afterwards. But I almost wonder if, in fact, story is primacy. And then life, at least the way in which we define it and talk about it and live it, actually comes after. And that story really is the birthplace of the holding, from which we then create our lives. And I think there may be some interesting things to talk about in the future, just about how those stories and what stories look like and feel like in the 21st century there might be some interesting inversions there that we could talk about. And I just want to throw out that I only knew as a kid that I wanted to do something to serve in some way with my life. And so I went to school to be a doctor because I thought that medicine was the number one way to serve. But that was an inversion, because what I should have done is served my gift. And when I discovered that I was good at art, what actually took me in as an artist, what got me, instead of without, was the fact that I didn't know what I was doing. The fact that I was in art school and I didn't know how to do anything. And I had to create things or make things up or be uncomfortable or be unstable. And that gave me an advantage over my peers who knew what to do. My mom used to always say, learn how to do it right, and then you can mess it up. And I started from the exact opposite. I didn't take any art courses in school until I got to university. So I had no idea what to do, and I had to learn how to do it by going through the process. And it is art that has led me back to medicine. It is art that's brought me back into this community and into this conversation. And and I'm here because of that idea of serving and being part of something else. So I just sort of it took a number of years and a lot of money before I realized that pursuing science was not my path to that. But again, act to know, and the process hopefully reveals itself to you.
And I just, Andy, you just revealed, I just really noticed a rigidity that in me that you revealed. And I wanted to just say as my final point and there's still a chance for anybody else that wants to jump in. We can get everybody's comments before we finish. But all of these koans are not ever meant as rigidities. Like invert inversions isn't a law, right? Like it's a noticing, right? And it's a way to help you wisely consider a movement and a positioning, right? But I agree with, but invert inversions can also be playful, right? It can also be a creative act. And so, like, let's say, like if I was being rigid and say, well, no, Andy, I'm going to push back and I'm going to say it's life that births stories, like I'm going to double down on that one, right? Life first. Without the living, there's no one to tell the story, right? But then when we come at it playfully, it's like, no, and I'm going to curse here a little bit, fuck that shit. Every so often if you see rigidity, if you're like purely rigid and there's no flexibility, even if you're right, you will be wrong. And this is a great place to play with invert inversions, right? Where it's like, oh, no, you're pretty rigid on that one, Bill. Let's play with that. Stories first. Why don't you live stories first and see what life comes out of that? Why don't you change up your story? That's great advice for me, So I want all of these koans they're not our right answer or a right way, right? They are what they are and they're their opposite, right? They are what they are logically and they're absurdity. All of that's true in this, right? And that's a really nice wisdom, capital W wisdom, to come back around to, because we got to learn to play with these things skillfully, right? Not rigidly. And languages, we have to be careful because language makes it seem more concrete than it is, right? Oh, we said it. Must be a thing. No. We've got to remember that we're just saying it poetically. It's just a flow, right? It's just a way to find our way into an alignment. Last thoughts, last call.
Just one last thought. One last thought. Life is a rhythm. We've been talking about art. And when I think of art, whether it's music or painting or poetry, for me, it's all a rhythm. And that's what life is to me. It's just a rhythmic vibration.
I'm sure there's a koan around in and about rhythm that will emerge as we go along. For those that have chosen to, in a literal sense, hold the tongue, but it doesn't mean that there's not, like Newman just said, a vibration or a rhythm. Before we go, if everybody has a chance to sign off, just place your hand wherever, even those that aren't on screen, it's fine. For yourself, for your own feedback, place your hand in the area of your body that you're in feeling, like dowsing for water. Just let the hand douse for the place that you are feeling right now, whether it's in ease or in dis-ease. Either is welcome. Just placing your hand, there you go. So nice. And that's its own communication to yourself and others, right? Just feel that acknowledgement. I want to end with my gratitude. Thank you guys very much. Thank you for coming out and supporting with your whole being, which is, so very important, the most important. And as always, the one last thing, I always have the one last request, and it's a cultivating request, right? For friends that had been, bring them back out, that have come out, bring them back out again. For those that haven't yet made their way, help people find the way into the cave so they can do art with us, that we can hold the light for them and them for us, right? So we can put our marking on the wall. And that's what we're doing. And by the way, that's why the recording is happening. It's not about content. Like it is their tracks, their markings, their modern cave walls, right? If you want to come back, if you guys want to reflect, you ever want to reference back, the first 3 weeks are up there on YouTube. This is our digital marking on the virtual cave wall. And it feels like that. Yeah. Oh, there you go. Let's give that a go. Greg, I love it. Let's there. That feels good. Everybody give that one a go. Let's try that for a second. Leave it on the virtual cave wall. Go ahead. Feel that. Yeah, that's it. Some of you are hesitating. Feel that up there. There it is. That, hey,
I'll post the documentary. Gotta watch it.
We've got two things: throwing Lego from the first week. Like we have to get bowls of Lego to throw at those that get rigid. That was week 1. And now we have another part of our culture, the virtual cave wall painting. And of course, we always have Alex's dance, which, by the way, a few times today, I was like, okay, I gotta start to remember to dance here a little bit. I got moved a little bit. So we're getting our virtual community culture. It's coming about. Thank you guys so much. As always.